Well, welcome, Jennifer Pazienza. I'm very happy to have you here as part of our revelations from the collection, and this is in support of International Women's Day. Um, and as part of the collection, what I'd like to look at is one of the works that we have of yours, and that's called Winter Sky. And I'm wondering if you could just give us a little bit of background about that work. Tell us what was the impulse behind it, and tell us just a little bit about your thinking about it now.
Okay, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be doing this. It's a real treat. Um, First of all, let me just tell folks who might be coming to us not knowing who we actually are. I live on Keswick Ridge in New Brunswick, Canada. That's Eastern Canada. And I have a whole beautiful valley that I look out onto and that I've been painting within and from and with for 28 years. So Winter Sky 1 has a really very personal story, very near and dear to my heart. So what happened was this. I had just come through the holidays with everyone here. It was the holidays of 2009. January comes, 2010. And as I sometimes say, I traded my kitchen studio for my painting studio. And I got out here, and you know, sometimes when you have a break, it's like you have to feel yourself, think yourself back into what it is you're doing. And before the holidays, I had prepared two really large canvases. The first really big canvases, which Winter Sky 1 is. It's 96 inches by 72 inches, so it's 8 by 6 feet. Sorry, I can't quote the centimeters. And I had those two canvases out here, and just a little backstory. I was only in the studio at that time 2 years. This was a new building at that time, and a new place in the landscape for me, right? To kind of ground myself in. And I have, you can see the painting behind me. This is a 19-foot wall, and there's a facing one. And I usually work on an easel. I have a big easel with a boat winch, and I can crank things up and pull them down. But the whole time I was working in the 2 years, those walls were like, psst, hey, psst, you can make bigger paintings. You can use us. Like we want to participate. You know, Gaston Bachelard's idea of the poetics of space, how the spaces we live in confer meaning and get us to behave in sometimes not so great ways, but in sometimes really wonderful ways. And so I paid attention to that call, and it took me a while to arrive at that 8 by 6 foot size, by the way, but I did. So I come out after the holidays, it's January, and I put the painting we're talking about up on this wall. And I literally look out my window, and it was very much a sky like you're seeing here today.
Yeah.
And I looked at it and I said, okay. And I just went over to my palette and I started mixing sky. And the next thing I knew, I kid you not, it's going to sound airy-fairy, but it wasn't. The next thing I knew, I was at the bottom of the 8 feet, and I could, you know, my back, like I thought, oh man. And I just like, you know, they talk about reverie. Well, that was my first experience with poetic reverie in painting. And it like the ache in my back woke me up, woke me out of it. And I stood back and I was like, holy man, like it was about almost, and I was of course 11 years younger, so I could paint for 4.5 hours without sort of noticing what was going on. But in any case, that's what happened. And then if you look at that land mass at the bottom, which is only about this much of the painting, it took me 2 weeks to finish it, to just get it right, to find my way back in. And then it was just, so I sometimes refer to it as the Karate Kid of my generation, with paint on, paint off, like wax on, wax off, remember? Grasshopper, wax on, wax off. So it was like paint on, paint off. But that was actually a gift, because I began to see more and more how not only do I use a range of brush types, but I use rags a lot. I draw a lot by taking away. I do a lot of rag work in my work, in my paintings, and that's an example.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. So it was an early work in this new studio that you have.
Yeah.
We've come quite a long ways now. Where are you at in your creative production? What kinds of things are you working on now? Are they
Well,
still landscapes?
uh, yeah, I've come to terms um, with the reality that a landscape is the lens for me in the world. It always has been. I just today finished the edits on a piece for Created Here magazine titled "I Carry My Landscapes with Me," and it's actually a take on American abstract artist Joan Mitchell's "I Carry My Landscapes Around with Me." She gets interviewed, and she's moved from the Chicago area, and she's in a Lower East Side New York, walk up, and they're like, what are you doing? You're in the middle of this urban center. Like, and she flippantly says, I carry my landscapes around with me. And when I read that, I thought, oh my God, like that has been my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
That has been my whole life from the time I was a little girl, making art in the shelter, and going back to childhood poetic reverie, making art in the very rich, packed garden of that New Jersey home, that Sicilian American, surrounded by the urban environment. And Marie, you'll remember in Beautiful Dreamer, Landscape and Memory, a paper that I gave in Sicily in 2015 for a bunch of international Jungians, who, by the way, told me I was incredibly individuated. I hear that, I didn't know until then. But in any case, I realized that I asked, how is it that with all this urban stuff that I grew up with, my work from childhood has always been about the stuff of the natural world, which of course we know is also about the cultural world too. And so now I just stopped thinking about it, stopped worrying about it, and just have decided that I'm going to go with it. But the more succinct answer to your question is, I have been painting here on Keswick Ridge. I'm going into my 28th year, and I wish I had a really great, easier answer for you, except to say that when I'm here doing what I'm doing, I am home, and that I understand better since Winter Sky One. I understand better what it is I'm doing. And my practice is a responsive practice. It's a response to my environment. It's my interior environment, and it's my exterior environment. And it's what I'm seeing out my window, but it's also about what's happening around the world. It's what's happening across places. It's emotional, psychological, social, it's all of those things, but it is a responsive practice, and it's a poetic practice. And what that means is that I come out here and there's continuity between the earlier work and the recent work. You can see what's sort of behind me. There's a faith that I've developed after all these years, a trust that when I come out here and I'm in this place, which is so emotionally, physically, psychologically supportive of me, has given me so much. If I just continue to trust that and pay attention to what calls, then I'll make work that's honest and credible, and maybe people will like it, maybe they won't. It doesn't matter. But it's always with that landscape lens. That doesn't mean that other things might not come into the paintings. Like you could see behind me, it's in recent years, I've been working with a place just outside here. There's a pond in my view, and these old apple trees and hawthorn trees drape over the pond, and I was working with the idea of over the pond, because 4 little paintings went over the Atlantic to Bologna a couple of years ago, and you know how we say over the pond, and I called the series Over the Pond for that reason. But I've been working with that for a while, and one day just literally smudged in color that were fading, dying apples on the tree. Now, I didn't ahead of time say, oh, I think I'm going to do some dying apples because it's metaphor for this and that and whatever. All that understanding of what my work could potentially mean for me and anybody else happens in reflection, happens afterward. I don't come out here and say, I'm going to paint about the loss of my mother. I'm going to paint about the celebration of my marriage to Jerry. I'm going to,
Yeah, interesting. Part of this series that I'm working on, or have been working on all year during COVID, is about revelations. So I'm
Yes.
wondering, have you, in this time of COVID, have you experienced an unexpected intersection, a revelation about your art, your life, your work? Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, revelation is such a great word because for me anyway, it's about what it is the work reveals to me about myself. I mean, it's also about what I reveal in the work about other things for other people. But
mhm.
you know, every time I pick up a brush and I face a canvas, I meet myself in ways that sometimes ain't that pretty. You know, I bump up against my limitations, my abilities, my fears, my dreams, my hopes, all of that stuff. And I think the context of COVID, um, because we have the stay at home, stay in constraint, and Jerry and I weren't traveling back and forth to the States and doing all of that, I actually was grateful. My one of the revelation, I'm not grateful for COVID, don't misunderstand me. That's not what I'm saying. But
Yeah.
I kind of liked, I put to good use, I think, that stay at home, stay in. Right, you have uninterrupted time, Jennifer. You've wanted uninterrupted time for 55 years. For 55 years, you were working and teaching and trying to do everything and maintain a practice at the same time. And now here you are.
Mhm.
And what I realized, or the revelation for me, was that staying the course is what my work has been about. I did a podcast for Sergio Gomez, artist curator out of Chicago. Sergio Gomez, he was doing interviews with artists around the world during lockdown,
Mhm.
and people had unbelievable stories. And I just sent him a note one day, and I said, "Is there ever any room for just people who aren't like turning their artwork into obvious COVID work? You know, they're not putting masks in their paintings or doing,
Right.
is there room for just somebody who just kind of like stays with what she's doing?" And he said, and I swear to you, I wasn't thinking of myself at the time. I was giving him a suggestion. And he said, "Oh, you know, do you want to do it?" And I thought, oh my God, I opened my big mouth. Anyway, I did do it. And um, I heard myself, when I listened to myself afterwards, I was at that time working on a triptych, which for me has all kinds of meanings in terms of Trinity and faith and, you know, the artwork, the viewer and me, and, you know, relationships of that sort. And um, what I heard myself saying to him is that um, this place, again, is where I am my healthiest. This is where I'm my strongest, I'm my healthiest. This is where, when I come out here for X number of time, then I go back out into the world armored. You know, some people ask me, what do you do to recover after a painting session? And I said, no, 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 that's not how it works. It's the
Yeah.
other way around.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not some facile notion of therapy. It's like a real thing. I mean, it's really about feeding my soul. And sometimes it's just damn hard work. I mean, not every single painting works. Not, like I said, I mean, it's hard stuff. So
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but that staying the course in times of difficulty, of trusting what you believe in, what has been faithful to you, this landscape, I, I mean, I respect plein air painters. I think it's quite amazing. And I do work outside, but I can't just show up somewhere and paint a landscape somewhere in the world. To this day, I haven't painted the landscape in Sicily. I've done other things.
Mhm.
It's as if this place early on has granted me permission. You know, if I could just continue with this for just 1 minute, if I may. Back before Winter Sky One, when I was painting in the house, in the living room in 1990, my first show at UMB in 1994, I started with squares because that's where my practice left off. And then suddenly the landscape said to me, "Are you out of your mind? You don't know me well enough to be painting intimate squares. You have to do this. Like, don't you see me? I'm a ridge." Like, and
Yeah.
then, as you know, that the long, skinny paintings came. And that's where my education began as a painter,
It
generally,
does
and as
actually in
a
that way.
landscape painter with this place. And it was affirmed by Elaine Scarry's work in On Beauty and Being Just. Something happens where the landscape greets you. And if you're respectful enough, there's this message it will send you. Yeah, I'll welcome you or I won't. And so it's been this growing relationship over the years. And And here I am back to squares, where it's a picture. That's probably more of a revelation answer than you wanted, but
That's all right. You talked about feminized landscapes.
yeah.
Talk to me about that, because this project is looking at women in our collection. So I'm interested in that term that you used.
Yeah, yeah. It's a tricky term to use because it can be misunderstood by some. When I was doing the work on Beautiful Dreamer, and I was reading everything I could on beauty, people theorizing beauty and the beautiful, because as you well know, that in the last part of the 20th century, like you couldn't talk about beauty unless you were talking about indigenous work or some other kind of work. Like you couldn't talk about it because it was seen to be this damaging thing for women and the male gaze and the female form and all of those contentious issues. Well, when I was doing my research for Beautiful Dreamer, Landscape and Memory, I came onto the idea about how landscape was also gendered female. So let me just step back for a minute. In Elaine Scarry, she goes back to Kant and Kant's notion between the beautiful and the sublime, and how beauty, if you read it, is charming and it's seductive and it gets feminized, it gets gendered female. Mm-hmm. And then when you read up Kant's definition of certain kinds of landscapes, you get those great sharp, and I say this with respect, I'm thinking about Douglas Copeland's landscapes that are on the grayscale, those images of the great north, stereotypically masculinized landscapes. And what happens was certain kinds of landscapes were also seen as lesser than other kinds of landscape. So when I talk about feminized landscape, I'm talking about Winter Sky One. I'm talking about a softness and a dimension that I think isn't weak at all, or isn't stereotypically feminine, but it's the challenge to how certain landscapes have been feminized in the pejorative sense, in a negative sense. Right. And I'm fine by me. And so in the face of knowing that, I continue to make work the way that I do, because it's what I do. It's the most honest thing that I can do. And I'll give you one last example. I was very lucky recently to get curated into Imago Mundi, that Luciano Benetton collection, where there are themes. This is the third one, Art Teorema, and the theme was on crisis. And the curator, Francesca Valente, called me from Toronto, and she said, I saw your work at a home in Toronto, and it's very beautiful. She said, and the person said, well, why don't you contact Jennifer? And she said, well, it's very beautiful, but what does your work have to do with crisis? And I said, I've been responding to crisis since my mother and father died, when I was a little girl in New Jersey. And she said, oh, well then, that's great. But what I did was, they asked for 2 4 by 4.5 canvases. They sent me the canvases to work on, and I could re-stretch them if I wanted to. And I did. And I did an iconic downriver Keswick Ridge, what very often people think of similar to what's behind there, but 4 by 4, knowing full well that it wasn't an image that was going to turn the art world on its head, or wasn't going to look like something innovative or something, whatever, but I did it. And another one that's more like that behind me, more of a direct compact, knowing that it was an iconic image, knowing that it was typically, and sent it off because, and so in a curious way, it's kind of a politicized piece, if people think about it that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, interesting. Okay, cool. So back to the sort of the idea of International Women's Day.
Yes.
Has there been an influential woman in your life?
You bet. I mean, several. Starting, of course, put my water down there. Starting, of course, with my mother. And my mother, I only knew for 9 years. But in those years, she taught me, I mean, it was the foundations for my aesthetic sensibility. She would say to me, if you're going to make meatballs, you're going to get 14 out of this much meat, and they're going to be this shape, and this is what, because it matters what it looks like when people eat it, right? So that's one thing. And she tied my bows on the back of my dresses, my little girl dresses, just, and I'd be standing there, you know, and she'd be adjusting it, and she'd say, "You can't see it, Jennifer, but everybody behind you can see."
There's a mother for you.
She was amazing, and she had a beautiful singing voice and whatever. She was my earliest introduction to attending to the idea of beauty and justice, actually. But fast forward, I had an amazing high school art teacher. Her name was Dorothea Fisher. What she was for me was a role model of independence, because I'm 67 years old, and I'm of that generation where I got lucky that I got to go to university, but I still grew up with the domestic stuff, which I'm grateful for, absolutely. But I didn't have a lot of female role models around me of independent women. In fact, quite the opposite. A lot of the women I was around could have been, in some ways, far more independent, but it was post-World War II, 1950s, whatever, a lot of domestic violence in my neighborhood, a lot of women suffering at the hands of their husbands or daughters at the hands of older brothers. I mean, a whole kind of thing. And not me, fortunately, but my mother, the hands of my father. But this art teacher was like this other world. Like suddenly, you know, all she cared about was talking about art and introducing us and, you know, giving us this foundation. And in my junior year of high school, she went on sabbatical. I didn't know what a sabbatical was. Like, I had no idea. And she went around the world by herself, and she sent me postcards from the places she visited. And every year until she died, she would send a Christmas letter with a little watercolor, and she was part of the watercolor, you know, association of whatever in New Jersey. Many years later, I got to introduce Jerry to her in 1992 or 3. Took him back to Bloomfield, New Jersey, and we had lunch together in her place. And she probably, you can hear it in my voice. She was like the person.
Right.
That I wasn't, it took me years to act on that. It took me years and years. And you may cut this out later, but Marie, you already know this about me. It took like 3 marriages, you know, to work, to actually arrive at a kind of independence.
Yes.
You know, because I was always struggling between, you know, being an independent, yet being attached to someone, because I was supposed to grow up and make babies and meatballs for the rest of my life. I wasn't supposed to be a university professor. That's, you know.
Yeah. That was really interesting. I knew about your mother, of course, and but I didn't know about your teacher. So that's awesome. In terms of your own production, in terms of your own life, what accomplishments, I think as a woman particularly, are you most proud?
Well, first of all, this moment, I mean, look at where I am. Here I am in this extraordinary studio, in this incredible landscape, in this glorious province that we live in. Pride is a funny word, right? Because it's a dangerous one. I'd like to shift, if you don't mind, and talk about gratitude instead.
Sure.
And it's yes, of course I'm proud that I have my PhD. Yes, of course I'm proud that I waited tables for 20 years and earned 3 degrees and, you know, took myself from New Jersey to Pennsylvania to Texas to Wisconsin to New Brunswick. Of course I'm proud of those things.
Right.
But none of us does these things alone. And if we think we do, we're in for a big awakening. And so for me, I'm just really grateful for, after the loss of my mother and father, and particularly my mom, I'm grateful for all those people along the way who assisted in those transitions that got me to where I am, having this wonderful conversation with you, you know, you included. I mean, yeah. And I'm proud, I guess I should say this, if anything, I'm proud that I've stayed with it, that I've managed to stay with my painting practice through all these years. And that I have had the courage to continue in the face of things. I don't know.
Right. No, that's good. That's good. We only have a short time left, but I do have a question for you.
Yes.
You know, you're an academic, you're an artist, you're very entrepreneurial. And during the COVID pandemic, when it first broke, one of the things that I very much admired was your series Got a Minute. So
Oh,
can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, you're in episode 36 now, my goodness.
thank you for bringing it up because thanks. Okay, so what happened was I belong to an international artist group called Art Next Level. And I've been a member for about 2 years now. And I mentioned Sergio Gomez, he's the artist curator whose program it is. And his whole thing is about operating from a position of abundance and generosity. So
Mhm.
great. Anyway, in that group, we were asked to, about this time last year, right now, just before we really, hit COVID here in March. So about this time last year, he asked us to create a 1-minute selfie video of an elevator pitch. If somebody asks you, so what's your work about? What would you say in exactly 60 seconds? So I wrote mine and I put up my little camera and did my little selfie thing and did it and sent it off. And then he said, and if you'd like to, make it a little harder even, what can you do on your Instagram page that will distinguish it from other pages, right? Because there's slews of stuff out there.
Mhm.
So by that time now, I had done my video. I actually translated the text into Italian for my Italian teacher, which was a great exercise to do. And now we're into March and COVID has hit. And I'm thinking, what can I do? And I swear to you, Marie, divine intervention, it just came into my head. I can turn those 1-minute videos back onto New Brunswick artists.
Mhm.
Got a minute, or excuse me, Instagram likes 1 minute before it flips into IGTV. So that was a creative constraint. I have my cousin Patsy in Rhode Island said, you do realize when you call me, you'll say, hey, Pat, you got a minute? It's something you say. So it really, I'd love to take credit for it, but it was like other forces like at work coming. And so I contacted a few artists and asked, I said, look, I have this idea. I want to do 1-minute videos featuring New Brunswick artists. I need to work out the design dimensions of this. Are you agreeable? And so I got about half a dozen people because I needed to have a few like lined up. And then I thought, okay. And then I had to learn the software. I had to learn how to edit videos. I sent out instructions about holding it in landscape mode, and I created the opening plate and the ending plate so every artist is treated fairly and equitably. I worked with Zach Dickinson, who did my artist video, Joy Cummings' son. For the first 2 episodes, I hired him, and through Zoom calls, I did everything I could possibly do, and then he answered my questions and showed me how to do some things. And by the 3rd video, I was flying on my own. I was, and so I launched Got a Minute on Mondays. Got a minute, just 1 minute, and people really love them because they are just a minute. I had a friend out west say, I binged on these. I said, yeah, probably like 7 of them. I said, that's 7 minutes. That's hardly a binge, right?
Well, in today's time and electronic media, it certainly is.
Yeah. And just to conclude, Marie, if I may, that's the art educator in me, right? That's still that person who, because one of the things, I am from away, I'm here 31 years, but I still there, and I love this place so much. And I just thought, when I'm making a Got a Minute video, I'm not thinking necessarily about New Brunswickers. I'm thinking about somebody in Jordan, somebody in Brazil, and they are seen all over the world. I mean,
Yes.
they get seen all over the world, and I love that about it. And I love the curatorial part about it. I love it when artists send me things and then I see things in the work and I go out on their Instagram page or on their website and I look and I really get to know their work really, really well. Yeah, I don't know how much longer I'm going to do it, but yeah, episode 36 was yesterday.
Well, congratulations. No, I really think it's a great idea and something that I think has really been able, these opportunities have really sustained artists over the course of this pandemic.
That was the other part too. It was too, like, just one little detail. You might be familiar with Artist Support Pledge that Bruce Matthews in the UK developed around COVID, where if you sell a work for $200 US or less, buy a work, you sell a work. But I didn't have any small work to do that with. And again, I was painting for Embracing the Square show, which is coming up next summer. I didn't want to just, I'm not someone who can like dash off work. Like so that was a way too for me to do that during the pandemic. So
right. Very interesting. Well, I think we're probably out of time here.
Okay.
I'm going to thank you very much for this great conversation, and went in all kinds of cool directions, and it was wonderful to talk to you and to see you in your studio. And I think the work that you do and the work that you have done, the writing that you do, the philosophical approach that you take to working as an artist are really meaningful. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Marie. I appreciate it, and I've loved working with you all these years. Remember, it was at the UNB Art Center that Winter Sky One was first seen. So
that's right.
Very, very much.
And I think it was Landscape, Love and Longing in 2010.
Exactly right. That's exactly right.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Marie. Bye.